There are two primary hangars at the Lonestar Flight Museum, and we'll start our tour here in the Waltrip hangar. The Waltrip hangar is dominated by World War II era military aircraft, the first of which is the Fairchild F-24, which dates to the early 1930s, making it one of the older planes on display. It was designed by Raymond Loewy, known for creating the logos of some of America's greatest companies, including many airlines, but also designer of the Coca-Cola Contour bottles and the interior of the supersonic Concorde. The fact that such an iconic figure in industrial design had a hand in conceiving this aircraft raises its profile to another level, and I think his design aesthetic is evident in the F-24. Next up is the T-41 Mescalero, which is actually a military variant of the Cessna 172, which of course is a default aircraft in Microsoft Flight Simulator. The Mescalero was used by both the U.S. Army and the Air Force as a training aircraft for several decades, starting in the 1960s. And this is the first aircraft on our tour that remains airworthy and that you can actually purchase a ride in. And those flights can be booked through the museum. This is the North American T-6 Texan, which of course was part of the Reno Air Races expansion pack for Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's an extremely historically significant aircraft in that it played such a pivotal role in training literally hundreds of thousands of pilots for service in World War II. And like the T-41 Mescalero, this is part of the museum's Warbird program, which means you can purchase a flight on one today. And continuing the theme, we have yet another military trainer, this one the famed PT-17 Stearman from Boeing. And as you can clearly see, this was a biplane that predated most other aircraft in the museum. In the decade prior to World War II, the Stearman ensured that the United States entered hostilities in the 1940s with a reserve of highly trained pilots. And you too can fly it in Microsoft Flight Simulator with the add-on from DC Designs. Now, last I visited the museum, the film Top Gun Maverick was still in theaters, and while what you see here is definitely neither an authentic F-14 nor an F-18 cockpit, it's one of the few opportunities in this museum that you or your child may have to immerse yourself in an aircraft mock-up, and with the Top Gun decals on the exterior, it makes for a great photo op. Well, there may be no more iconic World War II era aircraft than the twin-engine B-25 bomber, which debuted just in time to play an essential role in Allied operations in the Second World War, particularly in the Pacific Theater. And this exact specimen was painted with a Doolittle Raiders emblem, which is a reference to Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle and his band of Raiders, which conducted a daring bombing mission over the Japanese homeland in 1942 in retaliation for the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the B-25s were selected for that mission based on their range and payload delivery capabilities. Incredibly, this aircraft is also still airworthy, and you can purchase a flight from the Lonestar Flight Museum through their Warbirds program. The museum also owned a B-17, which was sold to another Texas museum, but the Flying Fortress still visits the Lonestar Flight Museum on occasion. And here we have an L-19 Bird Dog manufactured by Cessna. And this is yet another aircraft flyable in Microsoft Flight Simulator via an add-on from Black Box Simulation. In real life, it was introduced in the 50s and was utilized by the U.S. Army for a variety of purposes. In the Vietnam War, for instance, it would provide advanced targeting information to attack aircraft and then inspect the aftermath of the attack. At the Lonestar Flight Museum, there are a number of exhibits, aside from the planes themselves, that line the walls of each of the hangars. What you see here is a series of engines and other aircraft components. Now, we've managed to explore the entirety of the Waltrip hangar floor, but if we gaze upwards, we see what appears to be a bit of an anachronism next to all of these World War II era aircraft, and that is a Predator drone. And the MQ-1B, manufactured by General Atomics, is of course a high-endurance remotely piloted drone operated by the United States Air Force. This particular Predator saw extensive action in Afghanistan and was taken out of service only a few years ago before being sent to the world-famous Boneyard in Tucson, Arizona, after which, of course, it was ultimately acquired by the Lonestar Flight Museum. And the footage you just saw of the Predator was taken from a balcony overlooking the Waltrip hangar. It is always accessible to the public, so be sure to stop by this terrace area during your visit. But let's move on to the Heritage hangar. And it is in this hangar that you'll find an even wider variety of historic aircraft, including some more modern ones. And first up is the Bohannon B-1, the so-called Exxon Flying Tiger. This is actually an RV-4 kit airplane modified extensively by famed aerobatic pilot Bruce Bohannon. In addition to its aerobatic capabilities, the aircraft is known for breaking a number of altitude and vertical speed records for piston engine and home-built aircraft. Believe it or not, it was able to climb to 20,000 feet in a mere 6 minutes, and it actually reached a cruise altitude of 40,000 feet. Something relatively new to the museum is the Shuttle Mission Simulator Motion Base, which is a fully intact and painstakingly restored simulator used to train astronauts in shuttle entry and landing operations starting in 1981 at the nearby Johnson Space Center, which is only a 10-minute drive down I-45 from this museum. But back to the shuttle simulator. Unfortunately, this is not an interactive exhibit, so you can't just jump in the sim and fly it, but the cockpit is illuminated as it would have been while operational, and you can also inspect the manuals, computers, monitoring systems, and other equipment that supported the simulator. Next, we have the Howard 250, which is really our first passenger aircraft of the tour. This is essentially a Lockheed L-18 Lonestar transformed by Howard Aero into an airliner, with larger windows, enhanced performance, and a range of 2,500 miles. This is really a very rare specimen, as you won't find many of these Howard 250s out in the wild. D. Howard, founder of the manufacturer, may not be a household name outside of certain aerospace circles, but he was a pioneer raised right here in Texas and was the primary developer of the Learjet. And this is a Sikorsky S-76A, which marked the famous helicopter manufacturer Sikorsky's entry into the civilian market in the late 1970s. This helicopter revolutionized accessibility to offshore platforms across the oil and gas industry. It remains in use for VIP transport across business and government, including by the United Kingdom in shuttling the British royal family between various palaces like Balmoral. There may be no more iconic vintage airliner than the DC-3, and this particular one is quite special, painted in the livery of Continental Airlines, which was a major Houston-based carrier ultimately acquired by United. This actual plane was originally part of American Airlines fleet before joining Trans-Texas Airlines, a carrier that eventually merged with Continental, who ultimately donated this plane to the museum in honor of their retired CEO, Gordon Bethune. DC-3s made air travel attractive and accessible to more consumers than any other passenger aircraft with its groundbreaking range and speed. And of course, you too can fly the DC-3 in Microsoft Flight Simulator. It was bundled with the 40th anniversary update and was developed by Aeroplane Heaven. Here we have an interesting project from the 1940s by a trio of Houston-based aviation innovators who once worked for Boeing. This is a sports plane manufactured right here in Houston, but due to material shortages brought on by the Korean War, only 5 were ever made, and this one was the last. If you don't have a chance to visit Space Center Houston, there are a few NASA items on display here at the Lonestar Flight Museum. Aside from the shuttle simulator we saw earlier, we have this SPR, or Small Pressurized Rover, built about a decade ago to support missions across the solar system or even moon colonization. And this so-called Centaur robot is an even more interesting piece. Built with lunar and Mars missions in mind, this humanoid rover has human-like hands that can perform human-like tasks and even operate human tools. It's time now to return to the World War II era with the Dauntless from SBD, which stands for Scout Bomber Douglas. The Dauntless was a carrier-based dive bomber that managed to sink 3 Japanese aircraft carriers during the Battle of Midway in 1942. It was produced throughout the war and performed admirably in the air forces of multiple countries over the years. This particular one, in fact, served in the Fuerza Aérea Mexicana, the Mexican Air Force. The Albatross is one amongst an iconic line of amphibious aircraft from Grumman. It was used by multiple service branches to perform rescue missions beginning in the Korean War. This particular Albatross is an HU-16B, which was an Air Force variant, and I must say the iPhone here hardly does justice in depicting the massive size of the Albatross. And you may not be able to find the Albatross on Microsoft Flight Simulator today, but the Grumman Goose was part of the 40th anniversary edition released last year. And last but certainly not least, we have the Corsair F4U-5N, which was a carrier-based combination fighter-bomber aircraft, complete with a folding wing architecture to conserve storage space. The Corsair is most famous for its exploits in the Pacific theater of World War II, but unlike some other aircraft of that era, it remained in service throughout the Korean War and lived on in other countries' fleets until the mid-60s. This one served in Argentina in the 1950s, where it remained for decades until its acquisition by the museum. And you can fly a variant of the Corsair, the Mark IV or FG-1D, in Microsoft Flight Simulator via the add-on from Milviz. Now there's so much more to see in this museum, including these original paintings depicting many of the aircraft on exhibit in the hangars. There's also an exhibit hall devoted to the history of aviation in Texas. It houses the official Texas Aviation Hall of Fame, which honors Texans who made significant contributions to aviation. Inductees include both Presidents Bush, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Howard Hughes, Herb Keller, Sully Sullenberger, Cowboys coach Tom Landry, Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry, singer Gene Autry, the Tuskegee Airmen, and of course, several astronauts. There's also an entire education center wing with informative and instructive exhibits geared mostly towards children, but I've personally found them quite illuminating, and I think especially for flight simmers and aviation enthusiasts who might never have attended a formal ground school, it's a great opportunity to understand the physics and mechanics of flight in a more formal and fundamental way. Well, I'm afraid that's all for today's tour. I really hope you enjoyed it. Okay, we're now in Microsoft Flight Simulator in VR with the HP Reverb G2 headset, and I've placed us in a PMDG 737-700 at Ellington Field, which is a joint reserve base that also accommodates flight operations for NASA. But the reason we're here is that the Lonestar Flight Museum is also located on these very grounds. So we're going to take off, do a very quick circuit, attempt a low altitude pass over the museum, and then turn around for a landing. And here we go.
Positive, ready to climb.
And we'll just level out here, loop around, and position ourselves for the flyover. We're just passing over the junction of Interstate 45 and the Sam Houston Tollway, or Beltway 8 as it's sometimes called, which is a huge outer loop around the city of Houston. Those tanks on the left are part of the Enterprise Echo Terminal, which is a huge crude oil storage facility operated by Enterprise Products, that feeds the many local refineries here southeast of Houston near the ship channel.
Sink rate. Sink rate.
And we're just heading over parts of the Ellington Joint Reserve Base now.
Sink rate.
And that, I believe, is the Lonestar Flight Museum. You see the two large square-like structures, which are the hangars we visited moments ago.
Too low. Gear.
Okay, we're over the field now, and I'm going to climb back out. And now we're traveling east towards the ship channel and Trinity Bay. Momentarily we'll do a 180 and head back to Ellington for a landing. And gear down. We're just crossing over the Sam Houston Tollway again, and now turning for a relatively short final.
1,000.
Lining up for runway 22. And we're passing over parts of the city of Pasadena. We're about a 25-minute drive from downtown Houston and about 15 minutes from Hobby. I haven't flown in a couple of weeks due to injury, which I'm still nursing a bit, and I haven't stepped into the PMDG for quite some time. So this should be an interesting landing. This runway is around 8,000 feet long. We put her down quite firmly and we're using auto brakes 3, so we have plenty of stopping distance here. And there's 60 knots. Welcome back to Ellington Field. I'm just going to find the earliest turn off, clean her up, and shut things down here.